This is the story of how former Kenyan cabinet minister Cyrus Jirongo died in a head-on collision on the Nairobi-Nakuru highway at 3 in the morning on December 13, 2025. But to understand the significance of this loss, we need to understand who Cyrus Jirongo was. A man who became a billionaire before age 30, sat in national security briefings with presidents, and carried grenades in his car, only to lose everything and die with over 40 billion shillings in accumulated debts. Today, we're diving deep into the life of one of Kenya's most fearless and controversial political figures, a man whose name became synonymous with money itself, whose political machine helped shape modern Kenya, and whose complex legacy continues to spark debate even in death. Saturday morning, December 13th, 2025, around 3 a.m. in the Karai area of Naivasha, and Cyrus Jirongo was driving alone in his white Mercedes-Benz E350, registration number KCZ305C, heading toward Nairobi. Coming from the opposite direction was a Climax coach bus, registration KCU 576A, a 65-seater traveling from Nairobi to Busia with every single seat occupied. And behind the wheel sat 52-year-old Kamau Githinji, an experienced driver with 8 years at Climax coach. What happened next, according to Githinji's account to police, was a series of split-second decisions that ended in tragedy. Jirongo's Mercedes exited from a petrol station at Karai and failed to properly yield when entering the highway, which Githinji noticed along with congestion on his side of the road. The Mercedes hesitated, then suddenly changed direction and entered Githinji's lane. Githinji faced an impossible choice in that moment. Swerving meant risking a rollover with 65 passengers aboard, and in his own words, when he tried to avoid the crash, he felt the bus could go off the road, so he stayed in his lane while Jirongo came straight at him. Brakes applied. Collision unavoidable. Cyrus Jirongo died instantly at the scene from serious head injuries at age 64. Several bus passengers were injured and taken to hospitals in Naivasha, but remarkably no other fatalities occurred, and Githinji only learned after police arrived that the driver of the Mercedes was the former minister. He later expressed condolences to the family. Rift Valley Regional Traffic Commander Sarah Chumo confirmed the death, and Jirongo's body was initially moved to Naivasha Sub-County Hospital morgue before being transferred to Lee Funeral Home in Nairobi. Speculation about Jirongo's state before the accident emerged, with some sources claiming videos showed him drinking at a party, but these claims remain unverified and were never confirmed by police. What we know for certain is that he'd been at a meeting with Western Kenya leaders in Karen, Nairobi before the accident, though reports differ on whether he was heading to his rural home in Lugari, Kakamega, or returning to Nairobi after a brief engagement in Naivasha. To understand why this death sent shockwaves through Kenyan politics, you need to understand who Cyrus Shakalaga Kwa Jirongo was. Born on March 21, 1961 in Lugari Western Province, now Kakamega County, he came from the Tariki tribe in Vihiga County and attended Mangu High School from 1978 to 1981, before graduating from the University of Egerton in 1986. One source mentions he studied business administration at Cambridge University in the United Kingdom, though details remain limited. And that's when Jirongo's story becomes extraordinary. By his own account, he became a billionaire before turning 30, before his 30th birthday, in Kenya in the late 1980s and early 1990s, when most young people were struggling to find their footing. Cyrus Jirongo was reportedly amassing a fortune through interests in real estate, agriculture, and construction, while running multiple companies including Offshore Trading Company, Sololo Outlets Limited, Cyrot Lelti, and Renton Company Limited. His personal life was equally bold, polygamous with multiple wives from different communities and many children, and just recently in 2025, he'd suffered the loss of his daughter Lorraine Elizabeth Kalamwa Jelagat Jirongo after a short illness that left behind 3 grandchildren for him. But 1992 would forever define Cyrus Jirongo's place in Kenyan history. Picture Kenya in 1991-1992, when the country was transitioning to multi-party democracy, and President Daniel Arap Moi, who'd ruled since 1978, was facing his first truly competitive election, while the opposition mobilized and KANU, the ruling party, needed something dramatic. youth for KANU 92 entered the scene, better known as YK92. Joe Kipkung, Fred Kiptanui, Joe Mongaili, Sammy Kogo, and Victor Kibanai originally founded the movement, but they nominated a 31-year-old dynamo named Cyrus Girongo as their chairman, while Sam Nyamweya became treasurer and Gerald Bomet vice chair. Among the members was a young man serving as treasurer, a junior member named William Ruto, and you should remember that name. IK92 wasn't just another youth wing, but an aggressive campaign machine that blended youth mobilization, money, patronage, and intimidation, while presenting itself as a youthful, energetic movement defending KANU and peace. The funding was well organized, highly visible, and closely linked to President Moi himself. And here's where things get wild with the funding. The Kenyan 500 shilling note literally became known as Girongo because of his lavish spending and cash handouts, and Girongo himself was quoted as saying, "Every politician has a price." But where did all this money come from? Years later, in a podcast with Edwin Sifuna, Girongo revealed what many had suspected, admitting in his own words that obviously it was Goldenberg scandal money, and even a bank existed called Exchange Bank, purposely set up under the pretense of looking for dollars while the central bank was giving money to these people and adding them 33% for some compensation. And that's the money that was being distributed. Goldenberg International, run by Kamlesh Patni, allegedly injected over 11 billion shillings into KANU's campaign. 11 billion shillings, and Girongo claimed he had no hand in distributing the loot. But the money flowed through YK92 like water. At age 31, Cyrus Girongo became one of President Moi's closest allies and sat in national security briefings with the president, while reportedly carrying grenades in his car during this period. Think about that for a moment. A 31-year-old chairman of a youth movement sitting in on national security briefings and armed with grenades. YK92 succeeded. They helped secure Moi's victory in the fragmented 1992 election against a divided opposition that included Jaramogi Oginga Odinga, Kenneth Matiba, and Mwai Kibaki. And with mission accomplished, 92 YK was abruptly disbanded in 1993 and declared unnecessary after achieving its goal. But the movement's impact lasted far beyond that election as a springboard for a new political elite. And many YK92 members later became cabinet ministers, party leaders, and power brokers. And that young treasurer, William Ruto, eventually became president of Kenya, which meant Girongo's protege would surpass him in ways that would later breed resentment. For a while, Girongo rode high on his YK92 fame. 1991 saw him become chairman of AFC Leopards Football Club. Then in 1997, he won election as Member of Parliament for Lugari constituency on the KANU ticket for his first term as an MP. The pinnacle arrived on March 12, 2002, when President Moi appointed him Minister for Rural Development. But this was the twilight of the Moi era. Girongo's cabinet tenure lasted only about 9 months, ending on December 27, 2002, when KANU lost power to the NARC coalition in what became a brief moment in the sun before everything changed. Girongo lost the 2002 elections, but in 2007 he came roaring back and regained the Lugari MP seat, this time under his own party, the Kenya African Democratic Development Union, or KADU, where he was the only MP elected on the KADU ticket. His second term as MP ran from 2007 to 2013. By 2013, his star was fading. He initially declared interest in the presidency, then pivoted to run for the Kakamega County Senate seat and lost. 2017 brought another presidential run, this time under the United Democratic Party, and the result was approximately 11,000 votes, which was 0.07% of total votes cast, less than 1%. For a man who had once sat in national security briefings with presidents, the outcome was humbling. 2022 brought another defeat when he vied for the Kakamega gubernatorial seat and lost to Fernandes Barasa of ODM, even though his UDP party had joined the Azimio la Umoja coalition. After the election, he congratulated William Ruto, his former protege, on becoming president. Right up until his death, Girongo remained politically active and had endorsed DAP Kenya candidate Seth Panyako in the Malava by-elections held on November 27, 2024, campaigning for him in the days leading up to the vote, while reportedly warming up to the united opposition when death found him on that highway. While Jirongo's political career had its ups and downs, his business empire tells an even more dramatic story of spectacular wealth followed by spectacular failure. Remember, Jirongo publicly claimed to have become a billionaire before age 30, but how he built that fortune and how spectacularly he lost it involves some of the biggest financial scandals in Kenyan history. Postbank Credit Limited, a state-owned bank that collapsed in the 1990s, counted Jirongo among its largest borrowers. In 1993, his company Offshore Trading borrowed 1.1 billion shillings using 1,000 acres in Ruai as collateral. And the following year in 1994, another company called Sololo Outlets Limited borrowed 1.65 billion shillings using 2.5 acres in Mukurukwa Ruben as collateral. Neither loan was repaid, not a single shilling. According to the Kenya Deposit Insurance Corporation, accumulated interest pushed these debts to over 40 billion shillings, and the Ruai loan alone ballooned past 20 billion shillings. Kenya had not enacted the induplum rule at the time, the rule that limits how much interest can accumulate on a debt. So the interest just kept piling up year after year, decade after decade. Then there was the NSSF scandal, where a Parliamentary Investments Committee report cited Jirongo for selling 2 properties to the National Social Security Fund at an inflated price of 1.2 billion shillings. And Parliament was told NSSF lost hundreds of millions through dealings linked to him. These properties belonged to Sololo Outlets, and in August 1992, an account was opened at Postbank Credit to facilitate transfers associated with NSSF money and Sololo. But by August 1993, NSSF had terminated Sololo Outlets' contract to put up 400 housing units in Hazina Estate. More debts piled up. In 1991, he borrowed 700 million shillings from National Bank of Kenya, using properties owned by Sammy Boyd, a YK92 founder, as security, and his company Cyrus left huge debts as well. The legal consequences caught up with him when the High Court declared him bankrupt in 2017, after he failed to repay loans amounting to hundreds of millions of shillings. Properties linked to companies associated with him were placed under receivership or auctioned, and courts ordered him to repay large sums to individuals, including Francis Atwoli, the COTU Secretary General. From the mid-2000s onwards, Jirongo faced mounting debts and prolonged legal disputes that never seemed to end. The land cases deserve special attention because they reveal how deep the corruption went, starting with that 1,000-acre parcel in Ruai that served as collateral for the 1.1 billion shilling loan. This land was originally part of 13,000 acres reserved for the Nairobi Water and Sewerage Company, and was formally registered to Nairobi Water in 1996 following a presidential directive. But somehow significant portions got transferred to private individuals and companies, including Jirongo's entities. The government repossessed the land in 2020 and gazetted it as protected public land. Then in 2024, the Environment and Land Court ordered cancellation of titles held by Renton Company Limited. The court ruled the land belonged to Kamunyang squatters and had been illegally acquired, but the order allowed the firm to retain possession of 1,643 acres during the appeal period. The Mukurukwa Ruben case is even more brazen, since this is the 2.5 acres used as loan collateral, land where AEF Ruben Primary School, a police station, a maternity clinic, and a vocational center currently stand, which means public land was used as private collateral. In 2016, Nairobi County entered an out-of-court settlement to pay Jirongo 250 million shillings, and the agreement required him to clear encumbrances and transfer a clean title, but the conditions were never met. Yet the county released the full payment anyway, which Jirongo then transferred to several individuals before the Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission summoned the recipients to explain the transactions. This pattern appears throughout Jirongo's business career: massive loans taken, collateral pledged, debts unpaid, legal battles fought, and a trail of public money lost. One of the most fascinating subplots in the Jirongo story is his relationship with William Ruto, where in the early days of YK92 they were allies, and Ruto served as treasurer under Jirongo's chairmanship. and was described as Jirongo's mtu wa mkono, his right-hand man, his assistant. But by 2016, that relationship had turned sharply adversarial, and it turned in the most public, most dramatic way possible. On May 12, 2016, at the requiem service for slain businessman Jacob Juma, Jirongo stood up and publicly linked Ruto to Juma's killing while demanding police interrogate Ruto. He claimed Jacob Juma had once slapped Ruto and likened Ruto to Cain in the biblical story of jealousy and betrayal. Ruto's response was masterful because he didn't deny the accusations directly, but instead reframed the entire conflict as Jirongo's bitterness over being surpassed. At a gathering of mourners, Ruto said his brother Jirongo sometimes gets angry with him because he used to be his right-hand man. And he gets angry now seeing how the one who was his right-hand man ended up becoming deputy president. But, my friend, you know it's about positioning yourself. That was a devastating counterpunch where Ruto essentially said, "You're bitter because I was patient and strategic while you were confrontational, and now I've risen to become the second most powerful man in the country while you're drowning in debt and legal troubles." And yet, when Jirongo died, President Ruto's tribute was remarkably warm and generous when he said he was deeply saddened by the passing of his friend, former Lugari MP Cyrus Jirongo, who was a relentless go-getter, a seasoned businessman, and a consummate politician who refused to be defined, let alone defeated by life's challenges. Ruto described him as a fighter in every sense: blunt yet warm, bold yet approachable, enlightened and endlessly entrepreneurial, and above all, generous to a fault, always willing to give, to uplift, and to back others with his time, resources, and belief. Never one to shrink from a tough stand or a grand idea, living on his own terms and leaving an indelible mark on Kenya's political landscape. That word friend does a lot of work in that statement, but it speaks to the complexity of Kenyan politics, where bitter enemies can speak warmly of each other in death, and where mentor-protege relationships can sour yet never be entirely severed. The tributes that poured in after Jirongo's death paint a complex picture of how Kenya viewed this controversial figure. Former President Uhuru Kenyatta described him as a bold and principled leader who stood firmly for his beliefs, saying his courage, wit, and commitment to standing up for what he believed in will forever be etched in the minds of those who interacted with him. And Kenyatta added that Jirongo passionately championed the interests of the youth. Francis Atwoli, the COTU Secretary General and the same man Jirongo owed money to, tweeted that this morning, with a lot of shock and sadness, he learned of the passing of Cyrus Jirongo, who was an asset to their community in Kenya, adding, "We loved him, but God loved him more, and may your soul rest in peace." Bungoma Governor Kenneth Lusaka said simply that death has robbed us of one of our greatest sons. Wiper leader Kalonzo Musyoka described him as a bold and charismatic leader who never shied away from challenging convention or pursuing his convictions with courage and clarity, saying his contribution to Kenya's public life and his distinctive voice in our national discourse will be remembered. Former Deputy President Rigathi Gachagua, former Interior Cabinet Secretary Fred Matiang'i, and many others expressed shock and condolences across the political spectrum. At Lee Funeral Home, former Minister Fred Gumo told mourners that in 1992, when we in KANU were almost giving up, Cyrus came up with very strong encouragement and told President Moi that we as young people can give you support and will win this election, and he did so much for this country. Gideon Moi, son of former President Moi and current KANU leader, said that over the years we shared many moments with Jirongo, who was a familiar presence, and at no point did he ever hide his convictions, being bold in thought and action. As a political figure, he played a visible and influential role in the country's public life, particularly during the final years of KANU as the ruling party, and he was energetic, fearless, and unapologetic about his views. Saboti MP Caleb Amisi called him a good man at heart, an astute politician who spoke uncomfortable truths and generous to the core. And Amisi canceled his own birthday celebrations out of respect for Jirongo. Even presidential aspirant Reuben Kagame weighed in, saying, "It is with a heavy heart that I share the sad news of the passing of Honorable Cyrus Jirongo, following a fatal road accident this morning in Naivasha. And we saw the wreck as we drove past there today, but did not know he was the one involved. The common threads in these tributes include words like fearless, bold, generous, fighter, and uncompromising. But notably absent from most of these tributes is any mention of his business dealings, his massive debts, or the corruption scandals. In death, people chose to remember the political warrior, not the bankrupt businessman. So, what do we make of Cyrus Jirongo, and how do we square the circle of a man who was simultaneously a political pioneer and a financial scandal, a generous benefactor and a debtor who owed billions, a fearless truth-teller and someone who admitted distributing money from one of Kenya's biggest corruption schemes? Critics would argue his confrontational instincts and lack of long-term political strategy limited his rise. And while his protege William Ruto played the long game and positioned himself carefully over decades, Jirongo burned bridges and made enemies. When Ruto told him, "You know it's about positioning yourself," he wasn't wrong, because Ruto understood that power in Kenyan politics requires patience, coalition building, and knowing when to advance and when to retreat, while Jirongo seemed to know only how to advance. His financial empire collapsed under the weight of massive debts that he could never repay, and the properties that were supposed to secure his fortune ended up being the instruments of his financial destruction. The very audacity that allowed him to borrow billions in his 30s became the anchor that dragged him down for the rest of his life. But here's what cannot be denied. Cyrus Jirongo helped normalize youth involvement in national politics, because before YK92, youth were seen but not heard in Kenyan politics, and after YK92, they were a force to be reckoned with. He pioneered political mobilization and fundraising tactics that are still used today, and mentored figures who would later eclipse him, including a president. He also represented a particular moment in Kenyan history, the chaotic, anything-goes early years of multi-party democracy, when the rules were still being written and fortunes could be made overnight through connections to power. He was both a product of that era and one of its architects. Former Minister Fred Gumo might have said it best when he told mourners that Jirongo did so much for this country, and whether what he did was ultimately good or bad for Kenya remains a matter of debate. On Saturday, December 13th, 2025, at 3 in the morning, Cyrus Shekalaga Kwajirongo's Mercedes-Benz collided head-on with a bus carrying 65 passengers on the Nairobi-Nakuru highway, and he died instantly at age 64. He left behind multiple wives, many children, his recently deceased daughter's 3 grandchildren, and over 40 billion shillings in accumulated debts. He also left behind a political legacy that spans more than 3 decades, from the 1990s youth movements that helped shape multi-party democracy, to mentoring Kenya's current president, to his own tumultuous career as an MP and cabinet minister. He left behind stories of carrying grenades, sitting in presidential security briefings at age 31, and seeing the 500 shilling note nicknamed after him. And he left behind the memory of a man who was, in President Ruto's words, generous to a fault, always willing to give, to uplift, and to back others. But he also left behind questions about how public funds were used in the 1990s, about how land meant for public use ended up in private hands, and about how someone could borrow billions and never repay a shilling. The bus driver, 52-year-old Kamau Githinji, made a split-second decision that morning to stay in his lane rather than risk overturning a bus full of passengers, which was the right call because everyone on that bus survived. But the collision was, as he described it, unavoidable. In many ways, that's a metaphor for Jirongo's entire life, where he lived boldly, recklessly even, always accelerating and rarely yielding, and perhaps that collision between his ambitions and his debts, between his political instincts and his strategic limitations, between the larger-than-life persona and the bankrupt reality, was always unavoidable. Cyrus Jirongo lived on his own terms, as President Ruto said, and he left an indelible mark on Kenya's political landscape. And whether that mark is ultimately seen as a stain or a signature will be for history to decide. But one thing is certain, there will never be another quite like him. The body was received at Lee Funeral Home by family and friends, including Lugari MP Nabi Nabwera, and political leaders from across the spectrum came to pay their respects while the vehicles have been towed to Naivasha Police Station for inspection, and the investigation continues. But the story of Cyrus Jirongo, the boy from Lugari who became a billionaire before 30, who carried grenades and sat with presidents who helped change Kenya's political landscape and then watched his empire crumble. That story is now complete. It ended on a highway at 3 in the morning, 64 years and 9 months after it began. Rest in peace, Cyrus Shekalaga. Kwa Jirongo, because Kenya will remember you, for better and for worse. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. Want to be notified?